The disaster management cycle is a professional framework that transforms societies from reactive responders to proactive risk managers. Unlike a single event that begins and ends, this cycle is continuous and interconnected, spanning prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, rehabilitation, and build back better. In this lecture, we're going to walk you through each phase, grounding in real world examples. So, think of disaster management not as a line with a beginning and end, but as a circle, each phase flowing into the next, with lessons from recovery informing the next round of prevention and mitigation. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030, adopted by 190 plus countries, makes this cycle explicit. Its four priorities align with the phases: understanding risk, strengthening governance, investing in reduction, and enhancing preparedness while building back better. For disaster management professionals, mastering this cycle is the difference between managing disasters reactively and preventing them proactively. So let's start with the first phase: prevention, stopping risk before it begins. Prevention is the most cost effective phase. It asks a simple question: how can we avoid creating new disaster risk in the first place? Prevention includes land use planning and zoning laws, which means restricting settlement in high hazard zones, coastal floodplains, earthquake fault lines, volcano slopes, and landslide terrain. When cities expand into these zones, they plan in future disaster losses. Then, relocation from existing high risk areas, moving vulnerable populations and critical facilities away from hazard zones before a disaster strikes. This is difficult politically and financially, but examples like post tsunami relocation in Indonesia demonstrate its long term value. Then, policy enforcement, stopping illegal construction, preventing deforestation in slope stabilizing forests, and blocking wetland conversion that removes natural flood buffers. For example, in Indonesia's 2004 tsunami recovery, the government not only rebuilt but also implemented strict coastal zoning laws that prevented new informal settlements in high risk areas, a prevention step that has reduced vulnerability for 2 decades. Then we move on to the second phase, the mitigation phase, reducing severity when prevention is not enough. While prevention aims to avoid creating new risk, mitigation acknowledges that some hazards cannot be fully eliminated. Earthquakes, cyclones, and floods will continue to occur. Mitigation reduces their severity through structural and non structural methods. Structural mitigation includes resilient infrastructure, which includes earthquake resistant buildings, flood resistant design, and reinforced storm shelters. Then there's flood defenses, embankments, levees, drainage systems that reduce flood depth and speed. For example, Pakistan's Sindh Flood Emergency Rehabilitation Project rehabilitated 205 kilometers of embankments to resilient standards, providing enhanced flood protection for 2.3 million people. Then we have building codes, standards that reduce structural failure in earthquakes, hurricanes, and other events. Then, if you look at non structural mitigation, it includes ecosystem protection and restoration. Mangroves reduce storm surge, forests stabilize slopes and reduce landslide risk, and wetlands buffer floods. In Bangladesh, Build Back Better recovery encourage farmers to switch from chickens to ducks because ducks are naturally more resilient to flood conditions. And then we also have land management, reforestation, wetland restoration, and avoiding development in critical natural areas. Mitigation is ongoing. It doesn't wait for disasters. Countries with sustained mitigation investments experience fewer deaths, and lower losses per event year after year. Then we come to the phase 3, preparedness, ready to act when danger arrives. Preparedness ensures people, institutions, and systems are ready to respond effectively when a disaster does strike. Preparedness includes emergency planning and coordination, pre agreed chains of command, response procedures, and resource allocation so responders know their roles without improvisation when stress is high. Then, drills and training, regular exercises that test plans and build muscle memory. The Sendai framework explicitly calls for regular disaster preparedness, response, and recovery exercises, including evacuation drills. Then, early warning systems, networks that detect hazard onset and communicate risk to communities in time for action. Earthquake early warning EEW systems can provide seconds to minutes of warning before strong shaking arrives, allowing people to drop cover and hold on. Then, resource stockpiling, pre-positioned emergency supplies, water, food, medical kits, temporary shelter materials, communications equipment to avoid delays when supply chains are disrupted. Then, training and equipment responders, search and rescue teams, paramedics, emergency coordinators, and community volunteers who have practiced their roles and have the tools they need. For example, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Bangladesh, all high hazard regions, have invested in national disaster management agencies and community preparedness networks that allow rapid response when typhoons or floods strike. Then we come to phase 4, response, immediate action during and after the event. When a disaster strikes, the response phase is about immediate actions to save lives, reduce suffering, and stabilize the situation. Response include search and rescue, teams trained and equipped to find and extract survivors from collapsed structures, floods, or debris. Emergency medical care, triage, treatment, and transport of injured and ill persons. Evacuation, moving people away from ongoing hazards to safety. Relief distribution, getting food, water, medicine, and temporary shelter to displaced persons. Coordination and communication, ensuring that responders share information, avoid duplication, and adapt to evolving needs. The response phase is time critical. The first 72 hours often determine survival rates and disease outbreak risk. Recent data from major disasters show that countries with pre-established response coordination mechanisms, trained personnel, and pre-positioned equipment achieve better outcomes, fewer secondary deaths from disease or exposure, and faster stabilization of critical services. However, response is costly and cannot solve all problems. Every dollar spent on response could have prevented 3 to 5 times more damage if invested in prevention and mitigation. Then we come to the phase 5, the recovery phase, restoring basic function. Once the immediate crisis passes, recovery begins, restoring essential services and returning affected communities to basic functionality. Recovery includes infrastructure repair, restoring roads, power grids, water systems, and communication networks so people can move, access water, light, and information. Service restoration, getting schools, hospitals, and markets operational again. Temporary housing, providing safe shelter while permanent reconstruction is planned and funded. Then, livelihood support, helping displaced workers return to employment or rebuild destroyed businesses and farms. Typical recovery unfolds over months to a few years and is labor intensive and expensive. Data from post-disaster recovery efforts show that the speed of recovery depends heavily on pre-disaster institutional capacity and funding, transparency and coordination among recovery agencies, community participation in decisions, and early Build Back Better planning. For example, Pakistan's Sindh flood emergency housing reconstruction project, completed over multiple years, successfully rebuilt over 150,000 houses and trained 20,000 masons in earthquake-resistant construction, turning construction into a prepared investment for the next disaster. Then we move on to the phase 6, rehabilitation, restoring dignity and resilience. Rehabilitation addresses longer-term social, economic, and psychological restoration, helping communities regain not just function but stability and dignity. Rehabilitation includes permanent housing, moving affected families from temporary shelter to safe, resilient homes. Economic revitalization, supporting small businesses, cooperative enterprises, and employment generation so livelihoods are restored. Mental health and psychosocial support, addressing trauma, grief, and psychological stress that persist long after physical reconstruction. Then we have social rebuilding, restoring community institutions, cultural practices, and social bonds that bind communities together. Next, institutional reform, strengthening local governance, building local capacity, and reforming systems that contributed to the disaster in the first place. Rehabilitation can take years. It requires sustained funding and commitment beyond the immediate post-disaster emergency phase when international attention typically fades. For example, Indonesia's Build Back Better recovery from the 2004 tsunami is a classic example. Through the Badan Rehabilitasi dan Rekonstruksi, or the BRR agency, the government coordinated not just rebuilding around 130,000 houses, but improvements to housing standards, formalization of land rights, better land use planning, and safer community design, fundamentally transforming Aceh into a more resilient place. And finally, we come to phase 7, Build Back Better, or BBB, creating resilience in reconstruction. Build Back Better is a principle that the recovery and reconstruction phase actively reduces future disaster risk, creating safer, more resilient systems than before the disaster. Build Back Better includes resilient rebranding, incorporating hazard-resistant design into all reconstructed infrastructure, earthquake-resistant buildings, flood-resistant housing, and wind-resistant roofs. Then, policy and institutional reform, using recovery momentum to pass stronger building codes, land use regulations, and governance improvements that might be difficult politically under normal circumstances. Then, risk-informed design, making design decisions that reduce vulnerability and exposure, relocating critical facilities away from hazard zones and restoring natural buffers like mangroves and forests. Then, ecosystem restoration, rebuilding damaged ecosystems, mangrove forests, wetlands, and reefs that provide natural protection. Livelihood diversification, helping communities build less hazard vulnerable livelihoods. For example, the Bangladesh duck farming model that we mentioned earlier. If you look at some real-world examples of BBB, or Build Back Better in action, starting off with Aceh in Indonesia, the 2004 tsunami. Rather than simply replacing destroyed structures, the BRR coordinated a holistic reconstruction that included safer housing design, better land use planning, and formalization of property rights. 2 decades later, Aceh remains more resilient and a better planned community than before the tsunami, demonstrating that crisis can be a catalyst for positive systemic change. Then, if you look at Christchurch, New Zealand, the 2011 earthquake, the government passed the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Act, providing a legal framework for expedited, transparent, and coordinated reconstruction. The rebuilding incorporated earthquake-resistant design standards which are higher than pre-earthquake code, and the city has become an exemplar of resilient reconstruction. Then, if we look at Pakistan, Sindh floods, 2010 to ongoing recovery. The Sindh Flood Emergency Rehabilitation Project not only repaired embankments but upgraded them to higher resilience standards. The Housing Reconstruction Project trained 20,000 masons in multi-hazard resistant construction. So the entire regional building workforce gained earthquake-resistant skills, a capacity that persists and benefits all future construction. Then the Zimbabwe cyclone Idai in 2019. Joint World Bank UN early recovery efforts coordinated across multiple UN agencies including UNICEF, FAO, WHO, WFP, and IOM to address resilient disaster recovery methods. This delivering as one approach integrated food security, water and sanitation, health and livelihood recovery into a unified Build Back Better strategy. So, why does the full cycle matter? The Sendai framework embeds this full cycle into its 4 priorities. Understanding disaster risk, informs prevention and mitigation, then strengthening disaster risk governance, enables all phases, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, that includes prevention and mitigation, and finally, enhancing disaster preparedness and build back better. That includes the phases preparedness, response, recovery, and build back better. So, when a country skips phases or fails to close the cycle, the results are predictable. Repeated disasters hitting the same vulnerable populations, rising costs, and deepening vulnerability. Conversely, countries that treat the full cycle as integrated, investing in prevention today, being prepared today, responding effectively when events occur, and using recovery as an opportunity to build back better, see measurable reductions in disaster risk over decades. So to wrap things up, as a disaster management professional, your job is to keep the cycle turning. First, advocate for prevention policies, land use planning, hazard zoning, and ecosystem protection. Then, design and maintain mitigation infrastructure, flood defenses, seismic upgrades, and natural buffers. Then, build and test preparedness systems, early warning networks, training, drills, supply chains. Then, coordinate response when events occur, clear chain of command, transparent communication, and resource efficiency. Next, manage recovery strategically, transparency, community participation, and forward planning. And finally, embed Build Back Better in all reconstruction. Use recovery as a moment to strengthen resilience for decades to come. The cost of prevention and mitigation is far lower than the cost of response and recovery. GAR 2025 or the Global Assessment Report 2025 confirms that every dollar invested in prevention and preparedness saves multiple dollars in post-disaster spending, while also protecting development gains and human dignity. The disaster management cycle is not a burden. It's the most cost-effective way life-saving investment any society can make.